Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm not gonna. Okay, I'm gonna keep this very short. Okay, or as short as possible, while still covering the things I want to cover and say, because I know we're all very sick of e-learning. It turns out I have a kind of ulcer in my stomach, and so yesterday I felt like I had like a volcanic eruption inside my belly. I couldn't like. I thought it was just like like acid reflux. It was pain. So I went to the doctor. Anyway, it should be fine. I'm taking a lot of medication for it now. I think I'm just getting old. Okay, so sorry about that disruption. It annoyed me because honestly, this course just won't get started. I hope that some of you took some time to look at the material in this kind of Amazon box, right? So imagine this was a textbook. This would be a box on the Amazon. They're basically just about 30 minutes plus another 10-minute video by New York Times about the Amazon, covering it from perspective of indigenous populations. That's the third one. From a political aspect, that's the second one. And then the first one's obviously just background. The readings are not required. These are just in case you're interested. This is the kind of paper that you should use to write your final paper. All of this is to give you an idea about the kind of research I want to see later. You might pick a case like this. You can't pick this case. You might pick a case like this. You might focus on papers like these. And that's the sort of final paper I'm looking for. I will share more of these info focuses every couple of weeks. I have a few in mind. Okay. I will now make the slides I would have used yesterday available. They're here. Oh, I have to make them all available. Okay, show and show. So these are slides I actually used last semester and kind of reshuffled. Okay, these are parallel and supplementary, as I have written there, to chapter 5. You must read chapter 5, especially if you want to answer one of these questions for chapter 5. Oh, by the way, response 2, like I said in my email, because of this whole weird disruption, the deadline will be Sunday midnight. Okay, just this one time I've done this because it's my fault. All right, good. So the slides I have, I'm going to go through them now kind of quickly. And if you have questions, email me and I'll try to be available tomorrow online for office hours, but or just by email. I can explain anything to you. Okay, I'm happy to do that. But you should probably use them like kind of just spend some time looking at them by yourself as well. Okay, because I'm not going to go through every single slide. This would be too tedious. Okay, so where are the slides? The first one is what is anthropocentrism? Okay, and so we've already used this term. We've talked about what anthropocentrism is. It's the idea that all value, right? Value as the object of ethical discussion, like what's good and what's bad and things like that. Anthropocentrism is the idea that all value is tied to human beings, to human beings and their interests. And in a sense, most philosophy has been anthropocentric because we're not doing philosophical debate with the pandas, unfortunately, and we're not taking other things into consideration unless they relate to our own needs, especially in an ethical point of view, right? Okay, good. Now, environmental ethics is telling us now, especially in the last 40 years, that anthropocentrism might be inappropriate. And so non-anthropocentrism or non-anthropocentrisms in the plural become possible. There's going to be many kinds, and we're already starting to get a sense of those. But like I said, we won't really get a sense of non-anthropocentric kind of views, the whole menu, until starting next week and moving on. We're still at that early point in the phase where, in the semester, where we're still looking at the early phase of environmental ethics and anthropocentrism. So I'll run through these kind of quickly. The rest of the slides are sort of quotations that illustrate these 5 points. So the themes that or themes, not 5 points, these 5 themes that articulate anthropocentrism it's not that anyone came around and said, okay, here's the anthropocentric view. It's actually historical. So Aquinas was writing 1,000 years ago, Descartes 500 years ago, Newton 300 years ago, Mill and Locke 200 years ago, Kant same time, a little bit later than Locke. Okay, so these guys have been, many of them didn't share a lifetime. Lots of them died before the others started drinking milk. Okay, so it's not one philosophy, but they're themes that gradually came together into one outlook, which today we look at and say, that's really what's at the heart of our anthropocentrism. And so any non-anthropocentric view is going to have to either take issue with all five or some of these themes. Maybe other themes as well that aren't here, but these are the five that we're going to focus on. And like I said, the slides to come, so like slide 3 talks about the first theme, slide 6 gets into the second. I won't be going through all of these. These are things that if you're interested, you need to read the kind of the passages I've selected. But I will say a couple of things about each one just quickly. So the first theme is the Great Chain of Being by Aquinas. Okay, and in a sense, this is quite intuitive from a religious point of view. Aquinas, of course, was a Christian theologian slash philosopher, and he basically says that everything starts with God. God is the source of reality, and the closest thing you can think of just a chain, right? A big hierarchy. The closest thing to God, like golden God, is other supernatural things like angels. Our souls will be close to God, or far away from God, depending on heaven or hell. But because we're slightly immortal, according to Aquinas, we'll be similar, right? But for now, we're still humans, and we're stuck in this body that we have, which brings us closer to animals, vertebrate, invertebrate. Plants are below those varieties, and then microorganisms. And then at the very end of the chain of being are inanimate matter. Now, this is not just a chain, right? Where like, oh, okay, that's how they stand. Like I said, it's a hierarchy. So obviously the value trickles down, right? It rolls downhill. And we're the top of the food chain, right? But we're not we're not as good as we can be, according to Aquinas's way of looking at the universe. And so his idea is that although God still has control over us, we have dominion over the earth. And this is one thought, a religious thought. Some of you have written your responses about this idea of dominion, and I'm really happy it caught some of your attention. But this idea of dominion is ambiguous. On one side, it looks like, okay, we have full control, we can do whatever we want. But also, it could also mean that no, we're more like stewards, we have a responsibility. Now, some people think that the whole idea of dominion is just wrong. And in fact, we don't have control over the earth, and thinking that we do is what's causing the problem. I won't answer this. All I'll say for now is that this is one of the anthropocentric themes. The idea that human beings are on this earth as sort of ambassadors of God, and that it doesn't matter what happens, everything on there except for humans. Okay. Um, there's a nice quote over here by Aquinas if you want to, check that out. The other thing here from Aquinas, I'll just say, I will look at this passage a little bit, is that human beings as moral ends, as in the only purpose that we have on earth is going to be a human purpose. And that's because humans are rational and purposes are rational. So animals can't have purposes. We'll see why that is very wrong for some people like Tom Reagan, who we're going to look at in a bit later in this lecture. Okay. So, but basically, he says very clearly, okay, like plants and animals, they don't have purposes in the way that humans do. And our purposes are also set by God. So clearly, humans are the point of existence. Okay. So in the first place, then, the very condition of the rational creature, humans, in that it has dominion over its actions, requires that the care of providence should be bestowed on it for its own sake. So basically, we're able to control our actions, so we should be able to have control over the world. Because then he goes on and says that other animals aren't like that. They're just kind of mechanical. Okay, I'll leave that aside for now. The second, but that actually brings us straight into the second great theme, metaphysical dualism. And I'll take that together with the Newtonian idea of nature as a big machine. So Descartes, you don't need to know too much about Descartes to understand this. You can check out the passages I have by him. There's two. I won't read any of these, but these are super interesting to talk about the difference between a human being, the soul of a rational being that is somehow invested with intellect and is immortal and all that, and how it's totally independent from the body, even though it's tied to the body during our lifetime. Now, the body, on the other side, is what everything else is made of, he says. It's just matter. It's like the earth, and it's like animals, and it's purely mechanical. Descartes thought that the body, he used to dissect cadavers, and he would say, like, it's just like a really complex machine. Look at all these tendons and muscles and stuff like that, and the heart is just like a pump. So obviously the body is just a machine, and our soul is what's immortal. And so look at this little duck robot. Like, he thought of all animals as just little machines, and nature ultimately as a machine. And this is the kind of theme that ties into Newtonian sort of natural laws being totally mathematical. So if you're familiar with Newton, you know his three laws, and he says basically the world is a completely mechanical place. Now, we don't believe this exactly anymore because we have now had Einstein and we have a lot of progress in physics. But for the most part, Newton's three laws, they do tell us a lot about the world. Now, at the time, he thought that that covered everything physical, including human bodies. And so the soul, especially for someone like Descartes, was the exception. And we can see how that kind of still fits into this great chain of being, right? Humans, yeah, they're like everything else, but they have something that's like God. Okay, like I said, I won't read the quotations. I'll just summarize quickly for humans are the locus of value, Mill and Locke, because we've already talked about this sort of thing. This is the real sort of philosophical articulation of anthropocentric theory of knowledge, right? So where does our knowledge of right and wrong come from? Well, it comes from us. And if it comes from us, then it can only be meaningful for us, right? So Locke and Mill were empiricists, and they believed in the idea that, look, value is something that is very tied with human life. Now, Mill and Locke weren't especially religious. So they were able to sort of carve out a space for anthropocentric point of view without all the religious stuff that Aquinas and Descartes needed. Newton was sort of in the middle. Mill and Locke, I think, for all intents and purposes, were atheists. Okay, at least in name, or religious only in name. And so their idea is, look, we don't even need the whole picture of the chain of being and God. We can just put ourselves at the top, and we are the locus of value because we're the only thing that has that way of thinking. 5, the moral community, Kant. I will also, there's quotations at the bottom here about Kant. He distinguishes with our relationship with nature, he says, we don't have any direct duties, right? He says we only have indirect duties to nature. I'm going to come back to this in a moment when we go to the other set of slides. But basically, Kant says the reason why you shouldn't harm animals is not because you have an obligation to them. Rather, you shouldn't harm animals because it's bad behavior and it can breed a negative influence on people. So, psychopaths start by strangling kittens, that sort of thinking. Or you might harm animals that belong to someone. That's why you shouldn't care. So it's very anthropocentric still. He says we have indirect duties to animals and nature, and that they only have instrumental value. They're not intrinsically valuable. Again, please take some time to explore all of these quotations by Mill and Locke. It took me a lot of time to pick all these out, and I hope that you find them helpful. Email me if you need to learn more about this, okay? Or if you have questions about that. So I'm going to close this. And here is the next lecture. set of slides that this is what I really want to spend time on today. And this is the part that is not just background for chapter 5, it is really like, it supplements chapter 5 a lot. So, and like I said, there's a lot of slides here, but I'm gonna sort of be selective, okay? Good. So some basic binaries, just to make sense of some divisions, okay? Subjective versus objective. When we say something is subjective in ethics, we mean that it relies on the person making the judgment. So it's something is subjective means that it's based on your interpretation or a group of people's interpretation that they agree on. Objective is maybe includes a subjective component, but objective is independent of what you or I think. Objective means that it's true or valuable in and of itself. And very often we basically say anything with subjective. Um, sorry. Okay, so that's one distinction. The other distinction that we commonly see is more normative, as in it's more direct, right? It's not about our knowledge, it's actually a statement of knowledge. In the first case, we say that something is instrumentally good, as in it's good for something else. Kant thinks that nature is not good for anything. Sorry, Kant thinks that nature is always good, but good for something, right? For it's instrumentally good. Whereas the intrinsic value of something for someone like Kant has to do with only people, right? Humans are intrinsically valuable. The distinction is not just Kant. We can think of it in general terms. Something that's instrumentally good is good for something. It's not good by itself, it's good for something. Money is an instrumental good. Intrinsic value, lots of people change this, but some people think it's human beings, some people think it's happiness. So, these are things that are intrinsically good. Okay, now you might initially want to say, well, are subjective goods instrumental goods and objective goods intrinsic goods? Not really. They can be, but it also can be complexified. Because, like I said, there can be subjective instrumental goods. So you might say, I think that this is good for humans. But there's also intrinsic value that's subjective. And here we mean something like, well, it's good according to humans. So it's not just good for us instrumentally, it's good in our point, like for us, it's intrinsically good. Happiness is one of these things. So money and happiness fit into this. You might think that happiness is only a subjective good, but subjectively intrinsic good, or intrinsically, or subjectively intrinsic good. By the same token, you can have this the variety in an objective flavor, okay? So you can say that something is objectively instrumentally good. So you might say, look, rain is not good. Rain is good for, nature to revive itself through different systems, right? Clouds aren't good. Clouds are good for other things. And so, and those aren't subjective. Those are things that are objective facts about the world, about the environment that we live in. Is there anything intrinsically good about, objectively intrinsic good about nature? That's going to be a strange question, because you think, well, maybe everything's just instrumentally good when we talk about objective goods for value for nature. Well, I think we can, maybe we'll start to see that some people will say, actually, the whole is good. You need to have the whole thing systematically working. And that's a good thing in and of itself. Well, I'll leave that aside. I just wanted to be clear about how some of these words are being used. Now, it gets even more complicated, okay? Because we're going to use the word subjective and objective. We won't use those words. We're going to use these words instead. Ultimately, anthropocentrism boils down to a kind of subjectivism when it comes to value, and that value can be instrumental or intrinsic. On the other side, non-anthropocentrism will turn into a kind of objectivity, right? Objectivism, but not fully so, because there's going to be different kinds of non-anthropocentrism, some less objective, some more objective. But again, all of these terms, they don't have a fixed meaning. All of these terms will be ways that we're using the terminology to make sense of different theories. Okay, so Um, Before I start to think about that, I'm just going to jump down to this slide 13. If we think in terms of you've seen this diagram before, the chapter 5 covers these sorts of views. These views fall under various types of individualism. Now, right in the center, we have something called orthodox anthropocentrism. I'll explain what that is in a second. And hierarchical biocentrism, these are complicated terms, but they're not really that complicated. The stuff in the middle would correspond to, let me just jump back to here, to anthropocentrism, right? Basically, the stuff in the middle two circles, they correspond, the views that fit there, and there'll be many different kinds, but they all fall under this basic idea that, look, ultimately values refer back to us. In that sense, they're subjective. We can still have intrinsic and instrumental goods. There's a kind of objectivity, right? But ultimately, everything boils down to us. But if we go back here, and what we're going to see is that the animal rights people talked about at the end of chapter 5, right? These people out here, well, they're starting to get out to one of these views, but not. I don't think they do it as radically as some other views will, but they start the conversation. Okay, and it's important to see how they start to do that. Okay, so that's again just one way to orient ourselves. Once we get out to these views, right, holism, once we get out here, then we're going to change our point of view. We're going to stop thinking in terms of whether it's from the human point of view or not. We're going to realize that that distinction is a problem, maybe. Okay, but that's a far way ahead, so we'll get there slowly. Okay, so you'll notice that I have a couple of slides. I mean, look, I'm not going to go through these slides. I'm already going over how long I wanted to, but these are definitions for moral considerability, which is discussed in chapter 5. These slides will explain to you what the idea of moral considerability is. And the basic idea here is that you can't assume that everything has rights, but you can think that, like trees and rocks have rights, but you can think of them as being morally considerable. Seems like a very subtle distinction, but it's a very important one in the beginnings of environmental ethics. Because people were able to say, well, you know what? What if I want to go into court on behalf of a forest? Can I make a case? And that's how it started. People in America wanted to defend a certain patch of forest from, I think, a dam probably. And this guy, Stone, Christopher Stone, was just like, look, I'm a lawyer. What can I do? And his idea was like, when you go in and represent someone that's insane or a child, they're not necessarily full rational agents with rights, but they are morally considerable. You can represent them. And so he completely broadened the scope of moral considerability. That's an interesting, uh, I think it's an interesting event that took place legally that changed our way of thinking philosophically. Okay. There's also stuff on John Passmore in the text. These slides will explain Passmore to you. You can ignore this slide. If you're curious about this, I'll explain that. But yeah, I think the rest sort of just explains itself. Joel Feinberg also is someone that is mentioned. I actually took this quotation from the textbook. He's important as well in the evolution of views towards non-anthropocentrism, right? Because it starts off with these basic first ideas like, are trees considerable? Can we think about animal rights? These slow gropings, right, toward a non-anthropocentric view, these all came in the 70s. And that's Christopher Stone's Should Trees Have Standing. He's a lawyer, right? Like I said. Okay, so those slides should help you read the book, but the book is what's important for this week. And again, please email me questions. I'm more than happy to chat about this forever. Okay, now I've already previewed the idea of spheres of moral considerability over here. But what I'm gonna do now is, actually, you know what? This stuff is really important. I'm gonna do, No, I'll do it now. It's fine. You can just pause me and come back. So this stuff is orthodox anthropocentrism. Sorry, that's just a kind of recap of the previous slide. You can ignore that. Heterodox anthropocentrism, that's not important. You can ignore these two slides. Okay, so that just kind of explains what these views are over here. We can ignore this as well. This is the bit, this is all I wanted to do. So this is the slide that covers the kind of the material supplementary and like to chapter 5, the last few sections on animal rights and animal liberation. So Tom Regan and Peter Singer are both super important. Singer was like the great grandfather of animal rights. And he published this paper, All Animals Are Equal, in 1974. Tom Regan, in my opinion, is much better. I think has a better argument. And Monkey disagrees. My cat doesn't think that Tom Regan has a good argument. Animals as Subject to a Life, that was published in 1985. Monkey. Okay. These are some basic kind of just points to keep in mind when you're learning about these two guys. But like the thing I really want to say is, if you want to write about animal rights, you probably, Singer is not interesting anymore. Singer was good historically. Reagan is more interesting. And there are many more interesting people, but this should take you in the right sort of direction if you're interested in this topic. I'm not too crazy about animal rights because I think that it's only the beginning. What you need to do is think more in terms of bigger picture. It's not just about animals, right? It's about where they live as well. And so immediately you need to think bigger picture. But it's an important step in the trajectory of where we're going, right? To think about moving from here, well, part of the natural progression was to talk about animal rights. But then what we're going to see is that there's a natural progression that breaks the idea of individualism. And we get into get into total holism. Okay, I'm going to put a stop to it there. Like I said, I'm not going to go through the slides. I want you to use the slides if you find them useful. If not, please email me so I can explain to you. And I hope that this week you can still write your response on something on chapter 5 if you wanted to. And I really hope that this is really the last disruption to this class because I really want to get going. So thanks for listening, and I'm available all day tomorrow.